I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. So we have Ramin, who's the executive director at arXiv, which is one of the earliest preprint servers housing millions of physics, computer science, and mathematics preprints. We have Kevin Tracy, who's the CEO and president at Feinstein Institute, a pioneer in the neuroimmunology space, whose decades of work has recently culminated in FDA approval of a device to treat inflammatory disease using vagal nerve stimulation. Just a couple months ago, right? I think, yeah. Wonderful. And then we have Tracy Teal, who is the CEO of OpenArXiv, the new umbrella for bioRxiv and medRxiv, which has done some tremendous work in the preprint side for biomedical sciences and clinical space as well. And then we have Brian Kim here, who's the professor and vice chair of research at Mount Sinai, and has published and pushed FDA-approved drugs in the dermatology space. So we have a nice eclectic group of people here, and I want to start the conversation off with really kind of the role of preprints. And so this one will go out to Tracy and to Ramin. So preprinting has opened access to scientific content in ways that journals haven't enabled in the past. Can you talk to us about what it has actually unlocked for different personas like researchers, the layperson, developers, builders, and by allowing that information to be open accessed and published prior to review?
So I think that the impact of preprint servers, particularly arXiv in math, physics, and computer science is actually, in some sense, glaringly obvious. Maybe I'll take the opportunity to talk about things that it does that are perhaps not completely obvious. And in particular, in the AI space, arXiv is really kind of at the bleeding edge, for better or for worse. Let me give you a little bit of a flavor of kind of how that works out. So the way that arXiv works, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is that papers are submitted by 2 p.m. It runs on New York time, and they go out at 8 p.m. So there's 6 hours. And that means we can't do a particularly thorough job of reviewing, but there is some screening, obviously. This causes people to really want to submit their papers at 1:59 p.m. as opposed to at 2:01 p.m. If you are in a super competitive area, you complain to the people running arXiv when your paper, which you thought was submitted at 1:59, was actually submitted at 2:01. So just to give you a sense of how important it is to get things out there extremely quickly. In my own area in computer vision, the sort of conference deadlines for people to actually submit their papers is typically in November. The conference itself is in June, but the discussions at the conference in June are not about the papers that were submitted in November. They're about what happened in May, and that's typically on the preprint side. So really, the speed of innovation. I mean, I don't think that preprint servers can take significant credit for it, but they're part of this ecosystem that allows this very rapid advance, and that's actually crucial. There's no way that journals could handle this, with all respect to my friends in more traditional publishing areas. The other part of the preprint impact that I think is interesting is that arXiv is the home for papers where if I were a journal editor or a conference person, I would think I would love to take this, but I can't. So if you want examples of that, the DeepSeek paper. Anyone who reviewed that would say, wow, that's really cool. I can't figure out how to justify accepting that. If I sent my reviewers, they would say, I'd love to accept it, but they can't. The Gemini tech report, the version of the Transformers paper that people actually read is on arXiv. So people submit their papers at all kinds of points in time, before it's finalized, after it's been submitted for the conference or for the journal, after revision's been accepted, even multiple versions after. So it's really sort of a very interesting part of the space.
Yeah, I mean, I would say similar things, but I can come at it. So bioRxiv and medRxiv are life sciences and health sciences. And so our prime example is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so preprints were mentioned at the highest levels of the government as an important way to share information because it was rapid and open and global. And so we saw a huge spike in preprints during COVID-19, and you saw them really used in identifying new variants, developing vaccines. And kind of to the same point, some of those preprints, about 80% of the articles on bioRxiv and medRxiv go on to be published in journals. So for researchers, this is a way of sharing their research earlier, most often. But during the pandemic and sometimes now, I think also with the emerging of AI and models in medicine, is that you can't wait that long, right? If you were describing a variant and putting it out in a journal, by the time it came in the journal, that variant wouldn't even exist anymore or be the one that we're talking about. And I think we're saying some of that same things in medicine and life sciences now, is like, if you're evaluating a particular model, if you're going to wait for that, the average time is 280 days between when a preprint comes out and when it's published in a manuscript. So you can see in that same space of rapid innovation, it's just too slow. The other thing is visibility. The preprints are read much more than journal articles. Even when you see the journal article and the bioRxiv, we just had some data back looking at like which are from an institutional breakdown, what are researchers at institutions reading, and bioRxiv is way above the journals. So if you really want your research read by the scientific community, by the public, journalists use bioRxiv and medRxiv a lot, just like arXiv, journalists are looking there. So if you really want your work to reach more people and be impactful, bioRxiv, medRxiv preprints, I think are really continuing to lead the way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it seems like there's like sometimes these societal pressures from COVID that have pressed people towards funneling into preprint servers and things of that nature. And so I would imagine also the inbound flow coming into preprints, increased so tremendously. How do you distinguish signal from noise in a world where you have all these things funneling as a preprint?
Yeah, a great question. So bioRxiv and medRxiv also have a screening process. Ours is, we say, 48 to 72 hours. Ours need to look like research papers, so structured, like methods, results. We have additional screening for medRxiv for things like personally identifiable information. And so that screening process right now is all done by humans. We are adding in some potential AI screening as well, but we have rubrics basically that meet all these criteria. The challenge that we're seeing that we've been talking with arXiv about is AI-generated content. AI-generated content is actually pretty tricky to distinguish as AI-generated content by AIs because it does look like a research paper. So it is still true that humans are able to distinguish, like, this isn't real science, or these list of references doesn't match the actual content, or we see this author just submitted 10 manuscripts in the last day. But this is a huge challenge for us that we're, to be honest, not poised to solve, because these are complicated problems that, Google and Facebook, right? It's content moderation, and we don't have the team and the resources. Like we're 13 people. We have 3.5 people on our tech team, so we're not prepared to really handle the innovation required to do some of this screening. So it's kind of an existential challenge, I think, for the scientific community as a whole, is how do we know what's true? Because the scientific community needs to trust that, the public needs to trust that. If we're building models based on the data that we're generating, our models have to be building on correct data. I don't know, you have more experience.
Yeah. Well, so if my previous comment was the good news, now for the bad news. The AI-generated content is, I think, probably a much more imminent threat to the preprint ecosystem than is widely realized. So let me give you some numbers. So one way to look at it is to look at how many papers arXiv rejects. And rejections are generally done by a person. So that's the most, in some sense, the most expensive thing. There's a bunch of moderators for arXiv papers who are domain experts, and these are people who are like full professors at major universities. Historically, the rejection rate has been around 1 or 2%. Currently, it's running around 10% and growing rapidly. This is an extremely alarming trend. If you want to understand why it's happening, well, there are lots of reasons, but if you want sort of a particular example, the undergraduates of the world have come to believe that having an arXiv paper marks them as a researcher when they apply to graduate school. And there are lots of undergraduates. This is actually, I think, a very imminent threat to the integrity of the preprint system. The way that arXiv has been looking at it is, to be sort of blunt about it, to make it more difficult to submit. Because in some sense, that's all we can do. I would love to have help from our friends in high-tech companies who are clearly doing content moderation successfully. If they weren't able to screen out AI-generated junk, your Amazon reviews and YouTube comments, et cetera, would be full of garbage. So clearly there's technology out there. I mean, maybe it's too expensive for us to use or whatever. There clearly are solutions, but this is, in my view, a fairly imminent threat to the amazing ecosystem we have.
And maybe as just a quick follow-up to that, are there any forms of like curation or even community validation that you guys are thinking about that could serve the function of this moderation rather than sort of internal humans?
Well, my friends at OpenArchive, because they're dealing with things where lives are at stake, have the need and ability to do something that's a little more careful than we do. We have 6 hours. It's hard for at least me to imagine how we could do something that was not purely automated in that time period. But certainly, we are open for suggestions.
And there are mechanisms for people to look at things after they're, let's say, published, right? We have comments, there's peer review. Some things we're talking about are easier way to make collections, to do curations. So part of the point of preprints is that you get it out in the public and then the scientific community can discuss it. So we could continue to build those systems, but the challenge is once we publish something, we don't withdraw it, right? It's an archive, right? And so if we're sharing something, and even if the community says this is wrong or this is AI, then that's just a whole other process. So there are mechanisms for the community to flag things and say this is a problem or this isn't correct. We could continue to grow those kinds of solutions, but they're not the same as, how do you indicate what's real science on your preprint server, because you can't really ask the community to take your whole, we have over 360,000 arXiv, I don't know how many you have. You can't ask the community to look at all of those and vet them, and then when they come to bioRxiv, they want to know that it's trusted, for some definition of trust. So we can't really just leave that open to the community, whether it's, real slop, for a better slop or not. That's not really a community function.
Okay, awesome. And one more question here, which is around, can preprints be a catalyst to break this like traditional kind of stance, and the way science publishing is done? So I guess what would need to happen in your view, to help bring like a critical mass to publishing via preprints? I think maybe it's a little bit more common in arXiv, but definitely in the biology space, it's still a lower percentile of publishing.
Yeah, it's much lower. bioRxiv, medRxiv, I think about 10% of manuscripts are preprinted, and arXiv, I'm sure I don't even know. A lot of them don't even go to journals. It's just very different community norms, right? So one thing is the community norms need to shift, and the community norms stay the same because of incentive structures within basically how people have their jobs, right, within academia. Because in the biological and life sciences, a preprint doesn't really carry weight for tenure and promotion in the same way that it does for arXiv. And so one is working with communities to shift cultural norms, to help understand how it's impactful, give other metrics of impact. But other ways we're thinking about it is really for it to be a better experience to share and read than the PDF that you print out that could go in the mail. That's the same for the last 200 years. We have so much more opportunity now with the way the web works to actually share our research in new, exciting, more modular ways so that we say, communication at the speed of science. So you don't need to wait 2 years to do all of your research and then publish your flat PDF where you've generated amazing like cryo-EM images and then they're represented in what you share with the research community as a flat image. So kind of from like that human-centered design, user testing experience, we can make this experience better for researchers, and that could help drive people wanting to use it. So that we can't change the incentive structures, but what we can do is come together as a community of scientific communication tool developers and develop strategies and connections for better experiences of sharing our research for scientists and for the people who use it, including the public, including policymakers. Right now, the scientific literature is really geared for other scientists. If we're publishing research in more modular ways, we can compose it and tell the story for a scientist or for a journalist or for the public. So there's a lot of options in terms of how the web actually works now, and leaning into that and making it something people want to do. That's what we have seen as another way that really drives new scientific strategies forwards, is when researchers themselves want to use it.
Yeah, and maybe I want to frame a question to Brian or Kevin, which is around the point that Tracy made around incentive structures. So these are like deeply rooted, ingrained incentive structures. And I'm curious what your guys' experiences have been, dealing with those incentive structures, and then if you have any thoughts on potentially a way where you can modulate those incentive structures.
Yeah, it was nice to hear you got your guys' take on preprints. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the value of preprints are in the biological sciences, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way, because the incentives are, because what you were talking about is the actual literal value of science as utilitarian value. And as you were saying that, I realized how much in academia utility is so de-emphasized, right? Because the incentives are very much like prestige status. So as you were hearing that, I was like, oh, okay, very useful, irrelevant, right? to how we adjudicate quality, promotion, recruitment. Try recruiting someone into my department with an arXiv paper. Impossible, right? Like, no matter how great the work is, impossible. They'll say, we're not going to even look at this person until it's in Nature, right? So even though it's the same paper later, 2 years later, So I think the incentives, what it's exposing in some ways to me, this conversation already out of the gate, is fundamentally where, and the theme of it is should and could or would academia be decentralized. I think the question is, what's the point of science at the end of the day, right? And what is it? And in some ways, the simple way to think about it is it's a better, more compelling explanation of reality, right? It's not publications even, it's not funding. That's what it is at its core. And then how do we layer that? And I think the question is then, in terms of incentives, why has academia come to the point where it's, like in my field, preprints are not really valued, in my opinion, right? They should be, but they're not. Quite frankly, even a therapeutic development in academia is not really lauded. So really useful things are often not emphasized. I don't think it even goes into the promotion package, even. So I think it's a kind of exposing some absurdities. And I'll end with the last thing. I was telling Kevin, I was at Eli Lilly, and they're showing me all their cryo-EM equipment that they had for a long time, and they were showing all the proteins that they had solved years before the academics were publishing their Nature papers. Right. So, and that's absurd in many different ways, but it tells you kind of this weird game we're playing, that it's not really utility based necessarily.
So I agree with everything that's been said so far this morning, and I would like to pick up on something I think Tracy mentioned, that we're living really in a time where there's, and Brian emphasized, a current culture of doing science. And in the publishing world, I've come to think of it as having a bestseller. And if you have a bestseller, you go down a particular academic path. But I've read a lot of great books that weren't bestsellers. And that's absolutely true in science. There's a lot of great new scientific advances that have been not published in the highest impact journals. But that is the culture that we are embedded in now. So it's caused me recently, and Brian and I have been strategizing on this, to think about, is there a way to build, look, you can't buck cultural trends, I'm not crazy, but can you build something different in a current culture that would grow into something new? And I think the key there is deciding on what the goal is, what the objective is. And I think if the objective is to produce cures, then it basically, and that's not everybody's objective, and it shouldn't be, but if you have a group of people whose objective it is to do science to produce cures, that would challenge a bunch of the current dogma embedded in our current culture. You would want to have potentially a new model where you had brilliant scientists to do the initial work, but they would have to be entrepreneurial as well. Otherwise, you're never going to get all the way to the cure stage. And I call it the 3 Ds: discover, develop, and deploy, because the cure stage implies that the thing has been deployed too, which means it's being sold, which means people can make money. But unless the starting point is acknowledging the complexity of those 3 stages and not jumping on the bandwagon that the current academic model has solved that, I would argue, having done it for the last 27 years to get this FDA approval, and having been involved in all 3 Ds, that the current academic model is flawed. There's not bad people. It just wasn't built to do that. The profit margin came into the academic model almost by accident, a few miles from here, some would say, maybe less than, maybe just down the hill from here. But now that has become sort of one of the metrics, it's complicated everything, because you've got to have a bestseller, you've got to have friends in the grants department, you've got to have friends in venture capital, and then you have to know how to do regulatory, you have to know how to do clinical trials, and at every point along the way, the incentives are misaligned. So you either think about new models, and I think the decentralization theme fits into that somehow, into a new model, I don't know how yet, or you acknowledge that you got to be lucky at every step along the way for 27 years.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so you and Brian have both had, I would say, successful publishing careers in some of these top-notch academic journals. And so, Kevin, I want to start with you. So you've kind of been there at the impetus of the neuroimmunology space. So over those 27 years, you've seen a variety of things. And it took 27 years to get FDA approval just a couple months ago. Where do you feel like there's been sort of hindrances or barriers that have stifled that path? Maybe you would have ended up here, but would you have ended up here earlier? If you can kind of shed some light on if that's around funding, if it's around publishing, if there were some external things as well too.
I don't think there's any bad people involved in the whole process. I think people go to work to do what they do. They learn how to do something when they're young. They keep doing it for a long time, but the problem is, if you look over the whole spectrum, there's no alignment of incentives at any stage of the process. So the inventor may or may not be aligned with the university. The inventor and the university may or may not be aligned. They almost never are with the first investors. The early investors may or may not be fully aligned with the early company employees. And certainly may or may not be aligned with the development process, with the subcontractors, and with the clinical trial process. Because they can be sometimes, and it's great when they are, but not always. Then you move into clinical trials and the misalignment with regulators. And again, there's no bad people involved in this, but it goes all the way up to the end of the line until you get the insurance payers. Now, maybe they're the bad people if you want to go after somebody, but not really, right? They have a job in the insurance industry to make money. So with a misalignment of incentives at every step along the way, I'm not in a rush to go back and point to one particular barrier. Because it was neuroimmunology, the story bridged immunology and neuroscience. And I did see in immunology sort of our early acceptance, a whole series of high impact papers and lots of grants. The neuroscientists weren't they just kind of stood back and waited. But now they're fully on board, and neuroimmunology is one of the hottest growing fields, I think, in all of science. But yeah, no, I think the simple answer is there's a resistance to change at every step.
Yes, question, Brian?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that there's huge value in kind of the traditional models because there's an element of, it's like if you publish a paper in Nature or something, it does enable a lot. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that that has no value. Especially early in your career, it's like getting a Michelin star in your restaurant, right? And I definitely played that game, right? To be able to stand out and not be lost in the noise, to become the signal, right? Whether that's legitimate or not, we can debate that all day long. But I felt like to get the job, to get the recognition, to have credibility. The irony now, though, is that what I think I'm most valued for now is all my failures, all the negative data that I never published, all the intuition that I have. That's what people are actually literally raising money on in biotech, right? So that's the irony. It's actually that 180 is what now I'm being valued for in the real world. When in fact, so again, it feels like a bit of a game. And then on top of that, what were the barriers? Yeah, it's not so much that you're talking to us. We made it through, right? So there was no obviously crushing barrier for me. What I wonder, and I mentioned this before when we had a ResearchHub conversation, is that I wonder how many people perished though that aren't made in this process and that never made it through. And that's what Kevin is speaking to: is what are those great novels that never were a bestseller? Because that's more what I wonder about, and not in an altruistic sense. I'm a little, like I do wonder every day, like I could have easily not made it through this, right, in a genuine way, right, and for the benefit of society, it kind of, as at large, which is not altruistic, it's actually very selfish. I care about the future of society. I have young children, right? I wonder, have we stifled innovation, with this process a little bit?
Yeah, well, I wonder what you guys think then. So there's the bestsellers, right? And sometimes there's not bestsellers, but they're great books, and those can be served up on the different preprint servers here, right? And I guess a question to maybe anybody who wants to take it is, how do you discern what not a bestseller is, but that is good? So is that something that ultimately makes it through the therapeutics pipeline? Is that something that has a lot of social mentions on, social media? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't align with incentive structures, but I think Twitter was very interesting in the scientific community because people who really knew a particular space, like had a very particular specialization, were sort of reading all of the literature. And then they were able to elevate certain manuscripts or certain articles or work in their field that then everybody would pay attention to. Someone would post it on Twitter and everybody in that field followed that person on Twitter. So it was sort of a curation. A signal was someone, kind of to your point, with experience and intuition was very aware of the space and then elevating certain literature. So we don't have that so much anymore. Blue Sky is not is still popular with scientists, but not the same way that Twitter was. So I think one thing that's interesting is what are curation mechanisms? Like how can we have individual people or algorithms, most read, other ways of indicating that something is something that people should look at that won't, to both these points, tie back to incentive structures. Alt metrics never took off, as a signal for hiring or tenure or promotion. So it's still misaligned, but we're thinking about that as other ways to indicate credibility and significance.
I mean, there are interesting startups in the space of trying to indicate somehow what's interesting. So there's one called AlphaCiv that some of you may be familiar with that allows you to comment on arXiv papers. They're overlay journals. They're sort of attempts to address this issue. I don't think there's anything that's really taken off yet. I do want to push back a little bit on the notion of incentives. I mean, it's clearly the case that preprints being accepted are a social phenomena. The different subfields, even in computer science, there are subfields where they exist as a first-class thing, and there are subfields where they don't. But just anecdotally, looking at some of the things that have happened on arXiv, the incentive structure that you need is not obvious. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There's an extremely famous math paper, probably second only to Fermat's, the proof of Fermat's theorem, that it was only published on arXiv because of a Russian mathematician. That's where it is. And arXiv is cool in math, I mean, for many reasons, but that certainly was a game changer. If you look at something like the DeepSeek paper, its success and its impact kind of provided sort of a permission structure for people to sort of publish things that are kind of like that. Here's something cool we did. Here's an engineering artifact that's cool. It's not the kind of thing that gets into a scientific journal. So it's absolutely the case that it's kind of a community issue, and it's absolutely the case that it's incentives. But I think those examples suggest to me that the actual incentive structure is not so obvious, that somehow, there are community shifts, and maybe the community shifts are just spectacular, best-selling novels, right? that use the metaphor, that happen for whatever reason to show up in the preprint space and then give you credibility. It's quite interesting. I think that probably the most interesting discipline that exists on arXiv in this respect is actually math, which is, of course, extremely rigorous, but also very, very slow. But preprints in math are first-class things, so culturally, for whatever reason.
Yeah, perfect. And maybe to go back to some of the more kind of therapeutic pipeline types of questions here is, there are obviously, incentive structures that have caused things to slow down to no fault of anybody's own. Are there steps in that pipeline? I think we can agree it's better to get scientific information out quicker through these preprint servers, and the speed to getting that out there is quicker. Are there areas where you feel like the slowness is actually not a detriment, but rather a benefit to moving slower? Sort of pinpointing where are the areas where you can begin to push and accelerate faster versus ones where it's actually preferred to stay slow.
So yeah, in terms of what has preprint done to actually accelerate certain nodes, I mean, for me, for one, is that you can talk about it. It's allowed you to talk about it, right? So you can actually cite preprints in review articles. Whereas before, we didn't have permission to even talk about a concept in a review article, that wasn't supported through full rigorous peer review. But now you can actually have a preprint and now start talking about it. And I think that's really important because you need to be able to conceptualize the science. And I think before the preprints, in my view, this is very personal, I felt like I wasn't even allowed, it was almost like a censorship, right? I wasn't even allowed to talk about something because the reviewers would kill it. And they'd say, well, no, that's not substantiated, what you're saying here, right? But now what we'll do is we'll put up the preprint and then we'll actually cite it and it'll say, here's the data, you can look at it and judge for yourself, so, but yeah, I think it is, I was funny, I was talking to Isaac Chu, my good colleague in the biological sciences at Harvard, and his dad actually is a Fields Medal, and he said it's so different in math. Because, and I think it's field intrinsic. In math, you put it up, and everyone can look at it, and it's immediately valued. In biology, it isn't. The preprint doesn't do anything almost sometimes. But I think there are ways in. I think what we're saying is, can we take the preprint, then breathe life into it, right? And some maybe these startups are trying to do it. I think there's ways we can do it, and I think there is an opportunity to curate, right? Because now you got it in the real world, and to curate that, it doesn't have to be archived necessarily. It can be someone else coming in and curating it. And I made jokes, I think, with ResearchHub before. Could we just pay 10 Nobel laureates a lot of money to do their top 10 of the year, right? It's flawed what I'm saying, but at least it's a start, right? You could start to pick a, Oprah does it with books, right? So why can't Nobel Prize winners do it? And then they go viral, right? I mean, at least you're creating another model of curation, right?
So echoing Brian and Tracy both, I think, I miss in the good old days, you'd go in the library, there was an index medicus, and you would go to find one paper, and you would end up walking through the stacks, and you come home with 12 new papers and 12 new ideas. And now there's obviously no index, maybe there still is, but it's certainly not in the weekly thing that would come out in paper. But I agree. There was a time in Twitter, and it was mostly in COVID. There's too many papers on archives for any one person to read. At least I can't. But I would see on Twitter, and I would start following a thread, and I would start pulling that thread, and it was almost like the whole world was validating and pointing me to quality. And I wish we had something like that. I think that might accelerate. That might accelerate in the first D, in the discovery phase. I think it would accelerate the generation of new ideas. I don't think it would solve the practical issues of clinical trial development and IRB approval and regulatory and raising funding, but I think it would generate even more ideas. Then the question is, do we really need more ideas, or have there been so many ideas already out there that we can't develop them all, and we're overwhelmed in the first D, and that keeps me up at night. Is there actually an opportunity to figure out, of all the stuff that's already been discovered, how to prioritize it and go after things for the development stage? Because it could be maybe a lot of problems have already been solved, but there's so much emphasis in the academic model that on going to get promoted to find something that hasn't been found yet, that we're skipping over a lot of stuff, I believe, that's already been found.
Yeah, the LK99 situation was very similar. It was sort of replicated and tested out in the wild, on social media. So, Kevin, you pointed to this is sort of a potential solution, decentralized curation, essentially, is kind of what we're talking about here.
Did I say that?
Well, I put words in your mouth. But as a potential kind of accelerant to the first D, in the subsequent 2Ds, are there anything where you feel like this, wisdom of the crowd or distributing kind of points would help push forward any of the remaining 2Ds to the end of the pipeline?
I have given some time and work, particularly during COVID, onto the second D. And I think the big misalignment there, this will surprise some people, is actually sort of almost the exclusion of the patient's interests from the clinical trial process. So you've got the regulators that dictate this, you've got the IRBs that dictate that, you've got the hospital lawyers that dictate this other thing, and you've got the motives and of the principal investigators designing the clinical trials to do their thing. But along the way, what if grandma's dying of cancer and all the other therapeutics are gone, and there is a drug out there and she wants to try it? She can't even sign a waiver, and nor can the doctors or the company can't even sign a waiver to try this thing. So that, I think, slows down progress 100%, because there's ways of doing that where things that could be tested are not being tested. I have a neighbor at home, a very close family friend. She's in her 20s, and she's fighting a really, really bad disease. And having just tried to help, there's things out there, right, that could be tried but can't be. I mean, there's something wrong with that in this country with the resources we have and the brain power we have, and so that could be fixed.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's almost another layer allegory there where you have all these papers out there, and what are we doing with it? And then we have all these drugs out there, and that they can be repurposed. And I personally think that clinical trials should completely be in the blockchain. Right? It's just ridiculous that we use paper still, and if you make a mistake, you initial it and you circle it. And then the auditors come and they look. Yeah, and they make a mistake. Because I've designed clinical trials, and I've seen patients pop up on data sets that I'm like, this is absolutely wrong. This is completely false. But at least good thing it's randomized. Hopefully made the mistake on both sides, right? So, why that should be in the blockchain. I mean, there's no reason why we should be doing it the traditional, because then you can see exactly what happened all along the way. But also then we could eventually make it much more transparent for patients, because we need to decentralize that too. It shouldn't be so opaque. I agree. They need access because we're slowing that down. So that's, I guess, the deployment or the development, somewhere between those last two Ds.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, maybe just kind of to round us out here, I would be really curious, and I think we touched on this a bit earlier, but in each of your views, what would be the North Star metric of success? And this could be anything from replication to therapies or whatever you might think. But in each of your perspectives, what's the North Star metric that would define success?
Musical chairs and I got stuck. Well, I didn't sponsor this question from Northwell Health in New York, but thank you. I think I did allude to this earlier. I really do think it depends on what group of people you're bringing together to accomplish what. If the goal is to produce knowledge to cure disease, which is the mission at the Feinstein Institute, then I think we need to build a new structure, and I'm exploring that possibility in Manhattan. But I think and thanks to the coffee hour and some of the engaging conversations I had, I think it's also, we got to be really careful that we don't blow up we don't dismantle or blow up arguably the best scientific model to enhance the world that's ever come along in the history of the human race here in the United States. I mean, I don't think you can, seemingly what's happening with some of the decisions today in our government to take out the appendix, they're cutting through the carotid artery. I mean, you don't want to do that. But I do think if we're going to think about new structures and rebuilding things and decentralizing, it's got to be around teams of people who agree at the outset on what the long-term objective is.
I'll say one thing about these models for trying to sort of to curate preprints, which is that, I like Brian's comment about failures being super useful. So here's a failure which perhaps is interesting, which is overlay journals. So overlay journals have an idea of essentially curating things that are on preprint servers. For whatever reason, it hasn't taken off. In terms of the question you were just asking about, what's our North Star, it's, I think, easy to describe and hard to measure, which is accelerating science. I mean, it's clear that, in some parts of science that preprints have really made things go vastly faster than they would do in a world of conventional publishing. But that's hard to measure. You don't know the counterfactual.
Yeah, I guess I would say, along the lines of accelerating science, what I like to say is science helps people answer the questions that are important to them. And so getting that information in the hands of the people who can use it to help solve a problem in their community, whether that's the environment or health or a particular health group, is how can we enable those communities to have the information they need and disseminate their research as well. And right now that's just not true because there are a lot of barriers to participation in science through our existing system. So preprints help with that by making it globally free and available and low barriers to publication. But we still have a lot more work to do, and yeah, that's hard to measure. But I would say, that's big problems to small. It is cancer, but it's also, what are the mercury levels in my local lake? How do I know what those are? How do I know what the solution is? And making those small, quote unquote, small problems, which are big in particular communities, just as important as some of our also sort of quote unquote bigger questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened in the last 5 years is that there's just been tremendous enthusiasm for science in the real world. I think there's a lot of pessimism within academia for a lot of other reasons. But I think that the North Star is really, we're very fortunate because science has become so much, discovery science will always be discovery science in biology, but I think the engineering has gotten so good now that it's really changed what I personally feel is our responsibility in the biological sciences to not just publish the paper, and forget about it. I think we actually now have the capability. This city is probably one of the better examples of it, to take it to a product, to the real world. So it doesn't have to stay within a journal, within the ivory tower. I think we can actually make science products very, very quickly. And I think, to me, that's really the North Star. It would have been a lot harder for me to say that 30 years ago. But I think that that's just the reality that we're in. And it's very, very optimistic to me from that standpoint.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we're getting close here to the end of the panel, and I want to give some time for the audience to ask some questions as well too. But before that, I want to give our speakers a chance. You're in a room, an eclectic group of people, of policymakers, funders, publishers. What is one thing that you would like to tell them about or ask them about, or something actionable that you feel you'd want to say?
Tracy knows exactly what I'm about to say. In the world of preprint servers, what is needed is not good ideas. There are lots and lots of good ideas. What is needed is a sustainable funding model. The world of ideas, not just sort of in preprint, but sort of generally in kind of cool ways of disrupting publishing, is full of great ideas that perished because they didn't have a sustainable funding model. So I think more than anything else, that's what's necessary. And in particular, what's really hard for two of us to obtain is a funding model that sustains the daily operations. This is sort of why universities have overhead. Occasionally you will be, Tracy or I will be lucky and find somebody who wants to fund a preprint server to do the next cool thing. Nobody wants to pay to keep the lights on. And that's a serious problem.
I think I would put out a plea for some sort of national movement or activism to focus attention on the fact that if we lose a generation of young people from following on our footsteps and the footsteps of other people in this room, that we will suffer damage in this country, if not the world, that will last for decades, and nobody's talking about it. And in some ways, everything we've talked about here today is meaningless if there's not people coming in our footsteps after us. And we are facing a bit of an extinction, at least in biomedical sciences, if not in other fields too, engineering, probably maybe not engineering, but definitely in biomedical sciences, where the word on the street is it's too difficult. You have to go through this academic morass, this maze, and at the end you get spit out because no one cares. We've got to first, you can't navigate to a new future unless you decide where you are presently situated. We've got to start with that. We got to start talking about that.
So I'll certainly echo what Ramin was saying, and just that we need to fund the infrastructure that we're building all of these cool ideas on is key. And really also want to credit CZI and Dario and Carly at the Open Science program there, who did fund the operations of bioRxiv and medRxiv, which it would not exist without CZI's funding. That also allowed us to do this spin out to Open Archive. I think the thing that I would say is we need to work together. I love this panel that we have, our infrastructure, our tools, our scientists. I think we operate sometimes and we have our tool people and we have our science people, but what could we sit down and solve together? What's needed? What do you need from us? How do we get feedback from you? And have those sort of kind of from the tech, how do we do our market research? How are we really connecting with communities and making sure we're moving forward together across different types of work with the same goals?
Yeah, I think my plea, I don't know, I'm looking forward to talking to everyone here, I think is let's reimagine new ways. People complain about things, but if you don't the academic model for some reason, because I know academia there's a reckoning, then let's come up with a new model in addition. It doesn't have to be a replacement. It just can be an alternative. Just like preprints didn't replace traditional journals, let's come up with new funding models If it's going to be tokenization, let's talk about it and let's do it, right? So let's just do it and not complain, because I think we could do this.
Or implementation, less talking.
Pretty much the Nike theme, just do it. So I want to open it up, so we have about 7 minutes. So we'll start with Ruslan here, and then Jim.
Yeah, great panel. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed the discussion. So I have one concern in the biomedical space right now, and it's a replication, because we talked a lot about misaligned incentives, and in my opinion, that's the biggest. Like we have a research lab, if our hypothesis is true, we go to Nature, my research career is amazing. If the hypothesis is not true, I have no job. So we cured all major diseases in mice, in rats, in every animal. It doesn't work in human. So what I was wondering is, I mean, what I really love about preprints, and I'm a big fan of preprints, we get all our research out there to bioRxiv usually. They accept all results, right? It doesn't matter if it's significant or not. So what I was wondering is there any studies that show if the reproduction rate of studies on preprints is higher than those of Nature, for example? Because we try to reproduce so many things in Nature, 70% doesn't work, and I mean, it's a catastrophe if you think about it. So I'm just wondering, are there any efforts to kind of look if these preprints, if folks are maybe more honest, or put out data there that can be reproduced better than traditional journals?
I don't have the numerical answer for you, but I have a book recommend. It's called Unreliable, and it's by my friend and colleague for many decades, and I still can't say his name. It's Hungarian, Saba Szabo. But look up Unreliable on Amazon. It's a fantastic book. He deals with a lot of the things we talked about today, and he agrees with your 70% unreliable number. He goes into great depth that some of it is fraudulent, some of it is AI generated, some of it is methodological descriptions that were incomplete, so you can't do it unless you go visit their lab, and then when you do that, sometimes you can do it again and sometimes you can't. So it's a huge issue underlying trust. It's a huge issue underlying everything we talked about today. And I don't know, you read the book. We tried to bring him here to this meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I deal with industry a lot, and they actually often prefer the society journals because they say that the reproducibility is much higher than in the top tier journals. So, so Journal of Allergy or Gastroenterology rather than Cell Nature Science. I believe that because even for our own lab, sometimes the most straightforward projects are not Cell Nature Science worthy, but they cut like hot knife through butter, and I'm like so sure about the biology. But they're not sexy enough, right? Because they cut too clean. Yeah. So I totally believe that. And also, it's so funny, this is just an anecdote. When we published our first big paper in Cell, I remember I was at the American Association of Immunology, and a senior immunologist came up to me, and a little tipsy, and he said, no one believes it. Right? And I said, why? And he said, because no one believes that they could have missed this, right? And he was hazing me a little bit, and I thought, and I actually panicked for a moment. I was an assistant professor junior, and I thought, oh my God, maybe someone didn't reproduce it, right? Well, anyway, it's fine. We ended up developing a drug on the heels of it, and then no one questioned it after that. So then I thought, you know what, I'm just going to develop a drug every time we publish a paper. Because it seems like, even if it's in Cell, they don't believe me, right? But anyway, I'm being kind of playful here. But, I think these are real issues, though. And I've learned kind of how to judge a little bit based on that. And I do take a lot of, like, for instance, the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. Those papers are really good. Those are very reproducible, I find. Like, one example.
Yeah, I don't have numbers either, actually. We haven't done that study. Center for Open Science has done some in the psychology space. But I think another thing we're thinking about is like trust metrics. So if you're sharing your data, if you're sharing your code, are those manuscripts, are those articles more likely to be reproducible? And I would say probably yes. And so if we are able to have those trust metrics more visible, it might give you more confidence that it's something that is true and could be repeated, or at least you have the capacity to evaluate yourself.
Brian, I'm Jim Nasser. Interesting. I was really interested in your comment about blockchain. We've been doing blockchain, healthcare, and AI for many years now. So you mentioned two things. One, this idea of opacity, which I think is throughout clinical research, throughout public health. I was formerly chief software architect at the CDC and very familiar with what's going on with, say, opioid-related reporting. But then you also mentioned patients, right? Which I think, Jeff, I know in the world of crypto, that was the thing that captured people's imagination. Let's use blockchain, engage the patients, incentivize them. So my question really is, and it maybe goes back to this conversation about being unreliable with reproducing things, is do you see two things really? One, do you see pharma or traditional clinical research being at all interested in this kind of transparency? My experience is no. Like if I talk to Novo, like that's the last thing they want to do. The other thing is, do you see kind of the crypto side, like people like a Brian Armstrong? You know, again, my experience largely is that they don't care about this kind of thing at a deep enough level to want to kind of mobilize crypto powers to support this, because there is a little bit of a tragedy to the commons here, that somebody needs to take one for the team and actually make the investment. I'm just intrigued with your opinion about this.
I mean, yeah, the short answer is I don't know, but I don't see why pharma wouldn't want that, right? Because I think they can have better data, right? They can have cleaner data. One of the biggest tragedies of clinical trials is the failures don't get published. They sit in clinicaltrials.gov. And I said before, the biggest treasure of my career is all the failed experiments that I know which hills not to climb. So that is one of the most tragic things. And I'll be completely honest, as an entrepreneur, that's my goal. Because I know which trials failed and I know why, because I was in on them. And then I know how to innovate the next technology around that failure, right? But why is it that I should only be privy to that, right? That's really silly. That should be really out in the open. So I actually think there's a lot of opportunity. I don't know why people would not be interested in that. Maybe we can talk more about it, but I see huge opportunity there.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. We're at time now, so I want to give a round of applause to our panel to start us off. Thank you, guys.